Hi there, Ishi here, and welcome to The Higher Life, where I take concepts that are considered esoteric, spiritual, new age, and psychological, and unpack how you can apply the wisdom of these to really empower your life, to live as an empowered human being. And in this episode, I want to really dive a little bit deeper into some of the intelligence from relationship systems coaching that I've been doing over the years, which really focuses a lot on the human capacity for bonding, for being or working in larger systems, and we begin obviously with a smaller system, our family system, and then as we grow up and evolve and become young adults, we move into school systems and then out into larger systems or communities or networks where we continually discover new selves, new ways of identifying that give us a more expanded version of who we are and the kind of world that we live in. And if you're privileged enough, as I was over the years, to be able to set off quite young and travel across the world and spend time in different cultures, and I did that before the internet came about, so really packed my bag and left home for several years and traveled or just ended up in different countries where I didn't speak the language and really didn't know much about those cultures. And it was really eye-opening and heart-opening and just fascinating, because it made me realize how narrow my perception of myself, of the world, of what it means to be a human being and how to live life day to day was really conditioned by the family that I grew up in, and obviously the culture and the set of conditions that my country was in. So you have this kind of moment of awakening, I guess, that the world is not as small as it appears to be when you are young and growing up in a very sheltered or tribal environment. And then you sort of come back to your tribe, as I did many times, coming back home to Australia and feeling almost out of place or a little bit out of whack, because I had matured. I had evolved, expanded my perception on things, become more aware and awake to the diversity that is out there, but also the very core aspects of being human that we all share within the one humanity. And then you're back in your tribes and you can notice there's a gap between what you've come to understand about being in the world and perhaps some of the people that you've left behind who haven't ventured out of those smaller systemic units. And then I guess you reach a kind of ceiling. This is what it's been like for me in my personal life, where you've traveled a lot and you've met a lot of people and you've had a lot of different experiences. And I again have been very lucky to have been able to live for long periods of time in different cultures and settled and built a new life over and over again. But it gets to a point where reinventing yourself or expanding your perception of who you are and who other people are and what's available out there in the world also kind of exhausts itself. And this is kind of a strange period to be in. I equate it a lot to what I think is the middle age crisis, where you kind of reach a point in your life where you've exhausted all the youthful ways of wanting to expand and evolve and satisfy this insatiable, I think, curiosity or wanting or craving. I think in spiritual worlds they call it craving. I think in psychological terms it's a little bit of this sense of loneliness or not really belonging, or we often think that it's due to our childhoods of not really getting our emotional needs met in the way that we had hoped or required. There's a whole lot of supposed reasons as to why we feel really uneasy when we realize the futility of continually doing activities and seeking, because we kind of never get to that space where we feel content and deeply relaxed and fulfilled. And then this often triggers, as it has for me and I think many other people, a sort of inner self-reflection. Now, I've been quite self-reflective, I think, since very early on in my life. I go back to diaries when I was sort of 8 or 9, 10, all the way through, and there's this constant exploration of my own experience. And I've thrown myself out into my life in very extreme ways, not always the healthiest, but, to really get a grasp on, what happens being human when you put yourself in extreme situations. And it's been a ride. But of course, you get to a point where that all becomes very tiring. And for me, it coincided, I think, with also having children and the sheer exhaustion of raising other human beings and all the things that come with that. So you start to get what I think is, more engaged with the spiritual path. Now, that's not necessarily religious or esoteric or new age, but the questions of what is this really all about? Why do I use my energy the way I do? Why is the world unfolding the way it is? Why is there injustice, inequality? And why do some people seem to prosper and others don't? I think we are in a collective conversation across the world about why. Why do some cultures still believe violence is the best way to achieve freedom? And even very civilized, educated, and modern cultures respond with the equal amount of violence, even though we know, if we look at history, it just doesn't create anything but more violence and more destruction. And it's really fascinating, isn't it? Why is it that very educated, and I'm going to come back to educated human beings who've been at school, who've studied history, still recreate the same type of history? Why do some cultures still use archaic practices that are very harmful to the people that they love? It's fascinating, and I think if we could answer that question in a way that made sense, that was really accessible, we'd start to get somewhere in terms of being very open to the diversity of experiences of being human and the diverse ways that tribes or groups of human beings deal with being human and being human with lots of other humans in a set of conditions in which you don't really have the sort of control that you thought you did. So it's going to bring me to today's topic. It was a very long, slow entry into this topic, but I think it's important to understand the context of why I'm talking about bonding today, or attachment, the 3 levels of bonding that human seeking is played out through. And that when we look around the world and we view it through these 3 levels of bonding, we will start to understand why there's this disparity, or why certain human beings still seek very immature ways and very unconstructive ways to assert their sense of belonging in the world. And it's, if we really get this as a species, if we really start to understand this and apply it, I think that we will see a natural dissolution of the kind of global conflicts that we're seeing still playing out over the world. Now, the 3 levels of bonding really comes from, I think, more this family therapy, family trauma, family system psychology. And it's something that I've become very intimate with through relationship systems intelligence, which I've spoken to before, comes from a coaching model that I trained in for many years, and think it's still one of the most cutting edge intelligences that has been born into the modern world, really drawing on, I think, the very systemic intelligence of lots of old spiritual teachings, but it's very practical and it can be applied in a way that modern humans who are not engaged with more ancient or spiritual communities can get their head around. So bonding is a primary desire or need for the human being. That's what we've been led to believe, that when we are born into this world, we are born with a insatiable need to really be in connection with other human beings and to have this sense of attachment and bonding from usually the child to the mother. And the belief is that if that bonding or attachment doesn't happen well or powerfully when you're born, you kind of live in a disconnected state, and it is the source of all dysfunction and addictions. And that may be true. However, I believe through many years of coaching people that people who are born into very loving and well-adjusted families also tend to have the same uneasiness. So it's not as black and white as that. The thing is, and I've spoken to this many times, when I'm talking about the 3 levels of self, or, the enmeshed self and the empowered self, because this work is all about empowerment, is that we are born into a family system. So our first experience, of being here is being born into a system which gives us an identity, and it's the only identity that we know. So we call it an ego state. It's a sense of self that has been constructed by the system that we've been born into, and we believe that that's who we are for quite some time, I think, because most young children don't have access to the level of awareness that you might need to realize that that identity has been given to you, and you step into it like an actor steps into a character, and in a way you step into that character and you forget anything else. So that character and you become one, and you start living it out. Now, through life, you will start to come up against challenges or pressure points which will give you the opportunity to realize that you're actually an actor playing a character, and you might want to step out of that character and become true to yourself again before you became that actor playing that part in that particular system. So when you're born into a family system, you're born into really a tribal system, a very small unit where the primary offering is belonging. You belong to that family. Your identity is created through the attributes or the values of that family system, and if you're lucky, the family system will keep you safe, secure, and really, I guess, fulfill that need for belonging for a short period of time. But for a lot of families, and I've worked with lots of people who have grown up in very dysfunctional family systems, that actually hasn't been the case. They've been born into family systems with a lot of tribal issues, like systemic issues that have come from generations past, violence, addiction, all sorts of other things. However, the need to bond and to feel seen, heard, and included in that family system means that most children will still adapt into even highly dysfunctional families to achieve that result. And then, you go into a school system and into a university system, and really in the family system, the family usually operates in a culture or a community, a culture, potentially a religion, potentially an ideological community. So these tribes have very strong beliefs about who they are, what it means to be part of the tribe. And usually if you, for any reason, don't fit into the tribe or don't align with the values or the mission of that tribe, you can be excluded. So the fear of exclusion will often keep people in tribal systems and aligning to the values and principles and rules of those systems, even when physically, emotionally, mentally, energetically, it doesn't feel right for them. Now, that was really the experience of being human many, centuries ago, hundreds of years ago, maybe not even that long ago. But we still have tribes out in the world which operate in this very tribal systemic way, where the primary concern of the single human being is to belong, to be included, to access the resources, support, security, and safety of the tribe. Now, over human evolution, humans have, with much courage, or been consciously excluded from the tribe, have actually then gone outside the tribal system, the family system, and started to explore and expand and evolve their perception of what it means to belong. They've gone into larger systems, let's call them networks, and in a network situation, the desire for the human being has moved from this really core bonding called belonging, the need to belong, to be a part of, to be included, to a need to connect. So, when you go out into, as I did, traveling, or you leave your family system, you go out into other systems, suddenly you're in this kind of network of people, and potentially what's connecting you all is a shared sense of purpose at the time, maybe a shared interest, maybe it's a workplace, maybe it's a cultural situation, but this need to be included, this need to be part of something greater than yourself, this need to access the resources and to expand your possibilities is really alive, but in a slightly different with a slightly different vibrational quality and a slightly different agenda. You've gone from this really tight-knit, almost suffocating but very comforting tight tribal system to belong. Then you've moved out into broader horizons, broader terrain, and suddenly it softens a little bit. It's more about being connected, connectivity. We see the internet, people wanting to be connected through social media. But what we also know is there's not a lot of depth. I mean, there can be in the moment, depending on the quality of the interaction between the two people who are meeting in this network. But networks themselves and connectivity, it's more about movement of information. It's more about feeling connected through shared themes. It's more about raising vibration to achieve things like activism. So you can see how it's a bit looser. It's has a little bit less of a hold over you. And I believe in modern life, that's where we're at right now in terms of perceiving human beings as having evolved out of a more tribal mindset. Belonging itself is seen in a more objective way. So we realize, especially in the West, as we've become more independent minded, more individually focused, our independence is very important. We don't want to give it up in order to belong to a tribe. So if the tribe or the family starts to suppress our individuality, we'll leave the tribe. But in one way, we don't want to leave the security of the tribe's connective offering. So now we have sort of our feet in two different worlds. We want to stay included, recognized, seen, valued. We want the other to justify our existence, but we don't want to be suffocated, to held back, being asked to conform to a self that we don't align with. So we go into this more network style way of connecting, belonging, bonding. We're bonding with people through connectivity and through networks. And these networks can gain a lot of momentum. But as many people who I've spoken to over the years, and especially in the coaching world, where you sort of feel that you need to go out and bond with people in your field, and potentially bond with people where you can bring in new clients. Something that I've always felt very uncomfortable with. It's not my natural way, and I'll speak to why that is in the next level. However, with networks, there's a sense of loneliness, I think. Sometimes you feel like you're putting in a lot of effort, but while you may connect with people, you may not share their quality of spirit. That's a big one. You may not share their values, and you start to feel distrusting. That distrust that was there in the belonging in the tribe, when you realize that maybe the tribe doesn't have your individual needs in mind. They have the tribal needs in mind, and that's compromising you. In the network situation, it becomes like, maybe even though we have this shared agenda, this is doesn't exactly feel like my people. And it really highlights the vulnerability of believing that connection, that bonding itself is the source of your power in life. Because if I go back into this family systems therapy, a lot of people feel that they can't live out in the world in a really authentic, self-assured way because they didn't get their needs met by their family system or their tribal system, or they were abused in those systems. But the problem with believing that wholeheartedly is then, you can't go back and rectify that. So you can get your parents to apologize, or you can seek retribution through legal means in situations in which you were violated. But for most people who've achieved that, they realize it doesn't really change things. They still don't feel more capable of going out there in the world. What it does do is highlight poor behavior. It highlights trauma and abuses that society as a whole needs to pay attention to. So it does a good service, but it doesn't often bring them the personal power that they were looking for. And I always bring it back to this: as long as you believe that your personal power is sourced from a tribe, from another human being in any way, shape or form, or even from a God outside yourself up in the sky, you will always feel vulnerable, and you will always feel that you can't access your personal power, because there's natural truth to that. That is not the source of your personal power, so naturally you won't be able to source power from those external systems. And that's why it's so important to understand these three levels of bonding, because you're born into it as an ego self, an enmeshed self, where you believe the source of your personal power is the tribe or the tribal system that you're born into. when you come to understand how that system actually can hold you back from your personal power and hold you back from your independence and your uniqueness, then you leave the family tribe, but you don't want to give it up altogether. You haven't realized the core addiction there, the ego addiction to needing to be constantly recognized by the other, by the system, and therefore needing to play in and contribute to that system in order for that return to happen. So that codependency is there. So, in the network where I think most of us are out in the business world, it's very, very active right now. But you also feel the delusion, the disillusion coming, the disappointment that networks haven't really offered the whole or the larger majority of people that sense of belonging or that sense of empowerment that they were hoping for. In fact, what we've seen is networks of people being, in a way, the source of prosperity for one or two or three or a very small number of people who then access that network and draw on the resources of that network into their own personal wealth or their own personal power. So you are very vulnerable in a way when you are part of a network, and somebody with very with really great business acumen or is really sophisticated marketer can come in and actually almost manipulate the bonding of this network and draw the resources towards them. And we see that very, very strongly in what is called the nation. We have this large concept, these large groups of people that are identified with a national identity and the story of that national identity. And they go to war with other nations who have a different national identity and a different story. So you have these humans that are all part of one humanity who have two different stories that they believe wholeheartedly because they're over-identified with their self as a national, as part of a nation. They're kind of nationalists, I guess, and then there's a whole story that goes behind that. So if they were to realize that they were imprisoned by this attachment to a national identity, they would have to give up the story. And the story's been going on for centuries. So it kind of feels huge. But at the end of the day, it's the simple truth. Anybody who is over-identified with a national identity will know it if they're supporting any type of violence that reinforces that story as being true and the other story as being false. It is so simple, yet this story has been perpetuating itself since time began. So we're at a point in history where it's this current phase of humanity that kind of has to wake up and understand these three levels of bonding and the three levels of identification that come with these bonding, the nature of these bonding processes. So what comes after that? Well, this is where we return back into a little bit, I think, the spiritual teaching of wanting to come home, that we're born with this urge to come home. Now, in the family or tribal system and in the networking system, we see this desire to come home often play out in a kind of distorted way, right? In the family system, we see adults wanting to go back and kind of rectify whatever was done, what they believe didn't happen in their childhood with their parents. But the parents are often completely confused and just not able to understand what their children are on about. From their mindset, they gave their children the best that they could, and they don't really understand what it means when their child says, "You didn't meet my emotional needs," or "You weren't available." That's all language and awareness that's come in more recent generations. So going back and asking the generation before you to rectify something that they weren't even aware or educated in is kind of futile. But this coming home is real. So, as I said, when I was young, I was born into a family system. When I got older, I went out into the world. Then I went and lived out in the world. Then I had my own family out in the world. And then there was this moment where I thought, I'm done with that. What next? And I realized it's that coming back home. And I actually did come home literally back to Australia after being away for a really long time and having children abroad. And it was a confronting experience. I had left Australia without children, without a family, and I'd left behind unresolved patterns within me that, I thought I could escape from by going abroad. And so that coming home period for me was a very it rocked me at a spiritual level. You know, I had to really come back into myself and find myself and ground myself as a more mature, evolved person. But also in some ways I still hadn't resolved some of these childish tendencies or patterns that had played out over my whole life. And that's something that I speak to in my course, in some of the courses that I run at the Higher Life Academy. So I won't go in it today. But coming home, what I've realized really speaks to this third level of bonding, which is called communion. And communion is simply this recognizing of myself as a human being in a whole entity called humanity. It's universal. I'm realizing that I have this universal self, and the universal self is entirely independent of any other human being. It is so unique, it is so empowered. I can think for myself, feel for myself. I'm 100% accountable for what I think, feel, and believe, and the implications or actions that arise out of that. And this is in an ideal state. I don't think that I'm living at this level of power just yet, but I recognize that my true self is a universal self. I'm already, from the moment that I was born, belonging to this larger system, because I'm here, I'm alive, I'm breathing, and I'm part of this system called humanity. My contribution has already happened because I'm already born. But the part that I play, being a conscious being, is what vibration and what quality of spirit am I living my life day to day? You know, am I stuck still in an ego experience, really enmeshed, using my energy to be recognized, to be included, to have access? And occasionally I do that. You know, occasionally I reach out and I want to share something that I've done or share part of myself with communities that I think speak the same language as me. But I do it with the spirit that it may not go anywhere, and it doesn't define my worth or who I am in the world. I still get up every day or whenever and do these videos, for example, even if nobody ever watches them, and I kind of almost don't care if anyone watches them or not. I get such a sense of joy creating them. You know, I'm like a child. I'm like, what's going to come up next? And this contemplation just came over the last 12 hours because I had been thinking about what's going on in Israel and Palestine and obviously all around the world, and I'm always confused as to why do people keep doing the same thing knowing it's not going to work? Why is it so hard for people to give up on their stories when they can see that other human beings are suffering? You know, no child deserves to suffer just because somebody is over-attached to an identity. And we have to wake up to that. It's hard because, you know, all our ancestors have been living that story, so it feels like a betrayal. But it's a betrayal to your soul to let another person die in the name of your ignorance. So this is where we come back to the difference between a lack of education and ignorance. You can be a highly educated person but still living in a very ignorant way, and you can be a very uneducated person, as is, you had no access to education, and be really mature in your approach to being human and to being out in the world with other humans. So this level of communion, what it's really saying is I've come back into presence. I'm no longer living my life using my energy to reinforce a sense of self that is enmeshed. And I've spoken to that in the last two videos before this one, when I was talking about the gene keys and the work that the pathway that offers us to really liberate ourselves from living in this really enmeshed way. You know, and it's such an important pathway to walk. So absolutely, if you're interested in this work, you should check out those videos and the work of the Gene Keys by Richard Rudd. But really, at the end of the day, what I want to bring home is, if you want to understand what's happening out in the world in a way that makes sense and offers genuine compassion and helps you to be empathetic as to why some people still live in ignorance and others are living in a more empowered, enlightened way, you'll understand that they're seeking that sense of inclusion through one of those two levels. Either there's that tribal, they're operating in a very tight-knit tribal system, and they really believe that in order to be okay in the world, they need to align with the tribal viewpoint and therefore play out those tribal tendencies. But at the end of the day, their heart just wants to be loved. They want to love and be loved, but their bonding process is still very immature. It's still being played out from that very childlike tribal way. Then, you can look out in the world and you'll see, okay, there's people that have matured out of that. They get it, that those little tight tribes doesn't work anymore. We can't live like that. We have too much exposure to other tribes and we can't live in that level of denial and ignorance. So they've gone out, they're more sophisticated, more cultivated, more intellectual, more cultured maybe, and they're operating in larger networks. It's a bit softer and looser, and it's created some really positive impacts out in the world. But again, we see the limitations of simply seeking to be included, to be recognized, and to be validated through connection. Anyone who's spent serious time on social media, LinkedIn, Facebook, will know how futile it becomes after a while, because everybody's just aggressively networking to get a result for themselves. Even if that result or that intention is more charitable, it doesn't mean that it's not coming from the same need to be included, to have access to resources. A little sidestep, in Australia we had a lot of issues in the last couple of months on private boys' schools, having a really horrible toxic culture, really expensive private schools that have top-notch everything, but the behaviour is still driven out of these really ignorant and immature patterns. And so it's a really great example of throwing a lot of money at education and then realizing that it's really just facilitating more of the same immaturity and ignorance. So we kind of need to get out of that idea that education in that very formal setting with lots of money and privilege is actually going to lift us out of these dysfunctional ways of being in the world. We need to come back to understand that it's a heart-centered desire to belong, to be included, to be recognized. But actually, if we step further up and come home to ourselves in our presence, our universal self, our uniqueness as a human being, we'll realize that that's already done. We don't need to seek that anywhere, because when you're born, you've already made the contribution that you're here to make. And you can just relax and start to use your beautiful attention and focus on raising the vibration and quality of your spirit. And I think most people who move into spiritual work are looking for that. I just think that the ego tends to hijack many spiritual communities, and people are really still looking to be validated, but at that level of spirit. But it's actually the ego has stepped in, the enmeshed self has hijacked that spiritual pathway, because the enmeshment, the need to be validated through the group, the need to belong, to participate, to constantly connect with other people in that community, overtakes the work, the benefit that community can bring. So I think we do need to be wary of being over identified with any community that we're a part of, any gender rhetoric, any kind of framework, whether it's national, religious, ideological, gender-based, where we start to allow or invite in any type of fixed belief system or fixed sense of self. Now, sure, you can jump into a character for a week, for a month, have fun in those communities. It's like going on an adventure. I love it. I travel in and out of different teachings, but I always have this kind of river between myself and the source of wisdom that's coming my way, or the person, or the thing that I admire. And I really reinforce this with my teenage daughter. Always have a river. It's great to be devoted to a person or to a musician or to anything that gives you a sense of joy, but you need that river where you still are who you are, a universal being, and remain in your presence. And then everything will just naturally flow into you. It will transform you in the way that it's supposed to, and it will leave in its own time. And you don't have to hold on or stay attached or fight to stay in a community or fight for your way of doing in that community because other people don't do the way that you do, and you think that their way of doing is sabotaging the quality of the group. I mean, I've seen that happen so many times. So to nut this down, if you're looking at bonding, understand that we are born into a family or tribal system that tells us that bonding is what we need. It'll keep us safe, it'll feed us. And that's true for a while. But bonding may not be the source of empowerment that you believe it is. It is simply a way of us being in relationship with others that will help us to become more empowered by propelling us towards that realization or that revelation that we were always included, we always belonged, and we have always been recognized for being uniquely beautiful and powerful. We are universal. So I hope this has been helpful. If you like the approach that I take here, absolutely check out the Higher Life Academy, where I offer a one-path approach to personal empowerment that integrates the amazing teaching and wisdom of some of the most significant teachers and teachings out there at the moment. So until next time, take care and love life.